And if you look at 2019, we had some steady, very modest increases throughout the year in PVR. We jumped up with a nice little jump at the beginning of 2020, and then everywhere in the country fell off in PVR. And we all know what happened in March of 2020 with really the start of the pandemic. Those numbers started to climb a little bit after that, fell off towards the end of 2020, and then we really just saw exponential growth throughout 2021, upwards of, depending on what part of the country, 35 to 40% growth in PVR. You look at parts, like the West Coast going from around 1,600 to all the way to 2,200 PVR, and then you see similar trends throughout.
Yeah, a couple of those drivers too, just speaking to local dealers on my side, Jonathan, in the Northeast, is really dealers focused on two segments that are probably driving a lot of this trend in the last, let's call it 12 to 18 months. One is really focused around vehicle service contract and driving that penetration up and building value with their customers, as well as the average ticket price for vehicles these days are more financed than ever. So reserve is another big driver. Those two big drivers really kind of set that trend. And back to your point, it didn't matter if it was the Northeast or the West, that trend's pretty consistent throughout the country.
So as we go through this data, and we know that there's a lot more that we have to share, what would you say, or maybe just level set some perspective for dealers who are looking at this and they're way above, way below, or maybe their trend line looks nothing like this? Like, how can we help put that in perspective as we start to share more?
Yeah, for sure. It's natural, especially for those of us with a sales background. We're oftentimes competitive. You probably look at this chart and you're plotting exactly where your dealership is, and you may be above, you may be below, you may be somewhere in between. And again, there's several different factors that could play into, just because you're below these numbers does not necessarily mean you're performing poorly. Just because you're above doesn't necessarily mean you're the best F&I guy on the planet. But what I will say is the trend is important. If you haven't over the past 18 to 24 months seen similar trends, seen similar increases with F&I PVR, I think that's something that you should really look at, and really look at the processes that you're using in the store, the accountability in the store, to really try to identify why you haven't seen the same trends as other parts or other dealers out there.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think that's the important part, right? I think we're always going to have dealers that are performing at a good. They may be below these lines, but I think it's gone back to that trend line just to make sure that's an upward trend over the last 18 months. I think that's probably the biggest picture. And if that trend line is not that consistent upward trend and it's somewhat flatlined or going downward, then I think we're going to get into some other data here, which may be able to identify some opportunities on how to get it corrected.